Hello, how are you doing? It's a nice peaceful day in London, so I thought I'd film out here in my garden shed. I thought I would have a very quiet October and be able to do lots of reading. It's turned out to be a bit busier than I expected to be. I mean, does this ever happen to you where you look at the weeks ahead and you think, oh, I'll have some really good reading time, and it just sort of disappears and vanishes and things get busy, and it's just the way things go. But I did manage to still read quite a lot in October and have a number of books that I'm really excited to talk about because I think they're really interesting, especially interesting discussing them against each other. I happen to have read a few different autobiographies or memoirs or things which seem very autobiographically inspired, and so it's quite interesting to discuss them together, but as well some good fiction and a couple of quite big novels. Like I talked recently about some big books that I want to get through before the end of the year, and there were two big 500 plus page novels that I read in October. But I'd also love to know what you've read in the past month, if you've read any of these books that I discuss, or if there are other really great titles that you've come across lately that you want to discuss. Please let me know about that in the comments below. I always enjoy hearing about what you're reading or what you're looking forward to reading next. But first, I want to talk about Barbara Kingsolver's big, beautiful new novel, Demon Copperhead. This was quite a reading feat. It is 500 plus pages. I think Oprah announced it recently as her book club choice, and rightly so. It is such an immersive story. I just really got enraptured with this narrator, the central character of Demon, who is telling the story of his life from his birth up through his troubled childhood, through foster homes and trying to find work and struggling through drug addiction. So very much playing upon Charles Dickens' novel, David Copperfield, and but looking at contemporary America and through the lens of this young man who is very artistic in some ways, very gifted athletically, but encounters a lot of challenges in contemporary America in the rural area where he's born into, in the class and ethnic group that he's born into, and and all of those challenges. So he has a mother who's struggling with substance abuse and an abusive stepfather. He's never known his real father, and you follow him through his life and his development. How at one point he has to go into foster care, which is really haphazard, and he's sort of shuffled around and put through a lot of enforced labor, childhood labor, at especially at one of these foster homes, where he's made to work the tobacco fields, and he gets tobacco poisoning at one point. It's really poignant following his story, and really heart-wrenching certain moments where he's betrayed or done wrong, but also there are some beautiful moments of humor and friendship and people that do help him along the way, that are charitable towards him. There's a neighborhood family that he feels quite close to, but they have issues of their own that they're dealing with, and he has a best friend who he has a slightly rocky relationship with throughout his life, who his best friend turns out to be gay, and he's never had a problem with this, but he sort of sees the issues that his friend encounters through his childhood and adolescence and into his early adulthood. And it's really wonderful following his story and the way Barbara Kingsolver captures his voice, and really reflecting the state of adolescent malehood in a way that that I think is completely convincing, and is also showing a side of America that's not often portrayed in the media, or when it is portrayed in the media, is portrayed in a more stereotypical way. There's a lot of inquiry in this into the way that so-called rednecks are portrayed in the media, and people from rural areas of the United States, and the effect that that has upon him and his sense of identity, and the way that he feels he's perceived and looked down upon by the rest of society. There are so many poignant moments in this story. So yeah, it completely gripped me. I thought there was a really moving line at one point where she writes about language and how a thing grows teeth when it's put into words. And yeah, and there's so many lacerating words that are used against him, and she shows the damaging effects from that through time. So yeah, it's an incredible novel. I think Barbara Kingsolver is such a talented writer. I've really enjoyed her books in the past, and this is very different, I think, from a lot of books she's written before, but it's equally as powerful and moving, and like I said, totally convincing. So yeah, there's this quite long novel that I read, but also I read an older novel called Like People in History by Felice Picano, who, and I think this was published in the early 90s, and I read it as part of a book group, and so we got together and discussed it over dinner. And this novel is a it's part social history of gay America in the past, I don't know, probably like from the I would say, I don't know, 1960s to then, yeah, the 1990s, and following that very tumultuous period of gay history in America. But then it's also, so it's like part social chronicle, but also part kind of soap opera, because it is the tone and structure of this novel. It follows a main character throughout his life and his relationship with his cousin, and they're both gay, but his cousin is much more flamboyant and much more opportunistic, and sort of conniving in his relationships with people. Also, much more kind of snobbish, and he has these pretensions about him, which are really charming in a way. But I could imagine, like, if I knew him in real life, I'd find him really difficult to be around. And so yeah, you follow both of their developments throughout their lives, but then there's this parallel storyline which is happening in the present, where his cousin has come to this crisis point, and he has to make a decision about whether he's going to help him, or if helping him, what even that means, because he has a terminal illness. He's suffering a lot, and he wants to end his own life. And so his the cousin, the narrator, central character of this novel, is really trying to figure out what he's going to do about this situation. And it's really come to a crisis point. So you follow over the course of mainly one night while this is happening, but while that's occurring, there's lots of flashbacks through different stages of his life, and through these different stages of his life you see the history of this section of gay America, and especially amongst these privileged gay men, and how they navigate society. I mean, he doesn't come so much from, the main character doesn't come from privileged background so much, but he does have a lot of opportunities. It seems like I found it slightly irritating at some points, how he seemed to he would very dramatically like quit his job and leave his job behind, but then he would fall into another very like good position, so yeah, he seemed to have a lot of luck, as well as meet a lot of attractive people and have lots of romantic encounters with them, including one man who becomes the love of his life, who's a former military man who's described as like almost impossibly beautiful, but also has an artistic side. He's a poet, and so you follow their tumultuous relationship, which I didn't find entirely convincing, and yeah, there were some sections of this novel which just felt so almost operatic in there, the drama of these scenes, which is why I described it as kind of like a soap opera. But that also made it like quite fun to follow. I mean, I didn't take it all that seriously, and so just sort of enjoyed the ride of it and all the exchanges between these characters, which I mean, is really reflective of both the like frivolousness of the gay community, but also the serious side of the gay community and the political activism and the sense of togetherness and community and supporting one another, but then also slightly tearing each other down. And so there were. I love how it did show the complexity of the gay community in this way, but also, yeah, there were. I felt like it was slightly too long. I mean, it definitely could have been shortened. There were some sections of this which, just went on too long. But then there were also like interesting pockets of information. Like at one point, there's a fire at a bathhouse, and the central character is working as a journalist at the time, and he wants to write about this story because he knows that this incident and some of the deaths that occur in this bathhouse are just going to be sort of swept under the rug, and nobody's going to notice them, and he wants to memorialize the people that died in this place because he recognizes it could have been him as well. And also the political activism around ACT UP, and there's obviously a lot in this to do with the AIDS crisis because it's following that period of history through the 80s and the 90s, and so yeah, I did like enjoy the ride, and there were some moments in particular. There was one line that I found very funny where he happens to go to Woodstock and he meets a man there, and this man is making a remark about the attractiveness he finds in Englishmen, and he says that they were attractive in that peculiarly British manner, both ugly and pretty at the same time. And since I live in England, I just found that observation very funny. Also, there's one point where they can't find any transportation at nighttime. They're sort of at a crisis in New York City and trying to find a way to get somewhere, and it's the absolute middle of the night, but one of the characters named Wally, he makes this remark like what is this, London? and because famously in London, up until quite recently, it was very difficult to get anywhere in the nighttime. I mean, there were some night buses, but yeah, if you were out late at night, like past 12 or 1 o'clock, it was quite difficult to get home or get anywhere else in the city. Anyway, those are just sort of jokes that I personally found quite funny, having lived in England for quite a while, and that it's an American making these jokes. I found that funny. But yeah, also there was a scene in where they're trying to find their way around New York, and they sort of jump on these subway trains, which they don't really know where they're going, or they're supposed to stop at particular stops, but they don't stop there, and they just sort of rush past there, and it almost becomes this like surreal journey through the bowels of New York City, and I don't know why, I just really enjoyed the weirdness of that scene and the slight unreality to it, and maybe because it's sort of in the middle of the night and no one really knows what's I don't know, it's like, it's not like the daytime, it's not like it's almost this feeling like anything could happen, or the boundaries of time aren't really fixed, and yeah, it's I just enjoyed the weirdness of that moment. But there were some other scenes which I found very awkward. There's a big like confrontation scene towards the end of the book, with a lot of physicality, which I just didn't find very convincing, and frankly quite confusing, and yeah, was just a bit odd. And so yeah, there were positive and negatives to this book, but overall I did quite enjoy it, and that was sort of reflected in my book group, where there were a lot of mixed responses to it. There were some people in it that really hated this book, and there was a couple other people that really appreciated it. So yeah, it was interesting to go back to an older novel like this. So so this past weekend, it's Halloween today, but it's Halloween being celebrated a lot this past weekend. So I read this new short story collection called Terminal Zones by Gareth Rees. And this is published by Influx Press, that also published Percival Everett here in the UK. And so they find really unique voices to publish. And yeah, this is an author that that writes quite a lot about the experiences of people in rural England and sort of at the margins of society. A lot of people that are struggling with money and employment and jobs, and many of these characters are kind of oddballs that don't quite fit in. Some of them kind of practice these like occult religions. Others just have a slightly different psychology from that's kind of outside the norm, and so yeah, you follow their stories, and almost all of these stories also have to do with the climate crisis and in pending awareness of the climate crisis, and so some of the stories deal with this very directly. There's one story where two older women are living together in this, have a platonic friendship, and are living on this cliffside, and their home is literally falling into the sea because of coastal erosion and climate change. So yeah, some of them deal with it very directly. Another story is set in a zoo or an animal sanctuary, and how a fire breaks out there, and so there's this like big crisis, and some of these rare animals die in this fire, and you follow this father and his daughter trying to race away from it. And so yeah, some of them deal very directly with the climate crisis, but others, the characters are just sort of aware of it happening in the background, and so feel very anxious and stressed about it. And so yeah, it shows a real awareness for this, but also how these characters are both feel stressed out about it, but also find it slightly tedious, how it keeps being reported, but nothing is really done about it, and things just keep getting worse. And so it's really, I think, reflecting our own experience in that way. And there's a lot of imagination and unique narrative qualities to some of these stories. One of them is quite inventive in how it plays with time, and how there's these sort of modern crimes or crimes occurring in a modern time period, but then it's kind of overlapping with this this ancient time period in this kind of marsh-like space between the sea and the land, and yeah, I really enjoyed the inventiveness of that story. But then yeah, there's just lots of interesting characters in this who are so good to read about, and that I felt were handled very sympathetically, and also real diversity of characters. You get characters that are young, some are old, some are kind of middle-aged, or are at a point where they're at this uneasy transition between their young adulthood and all the promise and hope of that period, and then have kind of settled down and married and had a child, and are finding that transition very difficult, and sort of struggling through that. And so yeah, it's a really inventive collection, but also there's a dark edge to a lot of these stories and some sinister aspects of them. So yeah, it was quite good reading this over the past weekend, and kind of the Halloween mood of the season. Yeah, I thought it fit in very well, but also they're very like socially conscious stories that have an important message. And so like particularly the opening closing stories are almost in this kind of like horror dystopian type setting, where in the opening story there's a research ship going into the Arctic, and there's this creepy algae or these spores or this like conscious bacteria which invades the ship. And then the final story is it's set in the future in this dystopian setting where there's this oligarch and billionaire who's become a real reclusive, a kind of Willy Wonka type, who's been working on this invention which he thinks is going to solve all the problems of society, and he's developed the first conscious living computer, but then when that's revealed, it's like quite terrifying. And so yeah, there's a real sinister edge to these stories, as well as an interesting message to them. So yeah, that was good new fiction to read. But also then I read a book which I'm not really sure whether it's fiction or memoir or somewhere in between. I mean, the publisher defines this as a novel, but it's so, or it seems on the surface at least, so autobiographically inspired. It's Ti Amo by Hanne Ostravik, who's a Norwegian author, and she wrote this amazing novella called Love, which I just completely adored. It's such a chilling and psychologically fascinating novella that I love. And this is equally like a very short book. It's under 100 pages long, and it's following the story of the time between when the narrator's husband is diagnosed with terminal cancer, and then following through to his death. And but it's narrated in the second person, so it has this real personal feel to it. It's kind of like a love letter, but also like an ode to their relationship and the complexities of dealing with a situation like this. And the narrator, so many details about her life are parallel with the author's own experience. So the narrator is an author and has written a novel called Love and some other books which the author herself actually wrote. And so yeah, when I read this, I initially thought it was a memoir and read it kind of like that, but then it was I was talking with another reviewer about it, who and also the publisher defines it as a novel. So I mean, obviously the author intended it to, almost like welcomes that interpretation, but I have no idea about her autobiographical experience, if this is something she actually went through, or if she just completely made this up and decided to make a character that was so closely to her own experience. But it's an absolutely like beautiful, like however you define this book, it's an absolutely beautiful experience. How she captures the emotion of going through this very difficult period, and the knowledge that her husband is going to die, but he doesn't want to know if his diagnosis is terminal or not. So she's sort of carrying this knowledge and is carrying this burden, and trying to help him and assist him and deal with his pain management. Something I didn't mention about Demon Copperhead is that it deals so much with the opioid crisis, and at one point he gets an injury and he gets addicted to Oxycontin and some other drugs, as well as like lots of people around him. And so yeah, but sorry, that's I was just sort of mentioning that as something I forgot to talk about with Demon Copperhead. But yeah, in this he has a lot of trouble getting the correct medication to deal with his pain, this very serious pain that he's going through. And it's and there's this like one weekend where they're waiting for this doctor appointment so that they can get more medication, and it's just so heart-wrenching how she describes that experience of watching him experience such intense, horrible pain and not being able to do anything about it. And so yeah, it's so heart-wrenching, but also yeah, the difficulty of like day-to-day life. Day-to-day life continues even when we're going through these very traumatic things, and how she captures that experience, I think, is so beautiful and touching. And but also, yeah, the complexities of her own emotional state and wanting to carry on in her life but not being able to. And there's one point she goes on a trip and she meets another man who she suddenly feels this attraction towards, and so yeah, all the complex emotions which go along with that, and while also being devoted to the man that she's married to and wanting to care for him. And so yeah, I found this a really beautiful book. Also, the final book I want to talk about fiction-wise, and to sort of wrap up the Booker Prize season, I did finally read Treacle Walker by Alan Garner, and this which obviously didn't take me very much time. It's quite a short book, but I was quite intimidated going into it after all of the mixed things I've heard about this novel. And my experience was quite similar to people who were just a bit confused by it. I didn't really completely understand what was going on like many other people, and though because I talked about how I was slightly intimidated by this, I was directed towards some websites which explain some of the references which are made throughout this book, which have to do with a very specific region of rural England, and to do with mythology surrounding that area, and some terms which are slightly antiquated or not really used anymore. And so I did look up a lot of these terms after reading the book, and then went back and read some sections and tried to understand it better. And I didn't feel like it clued me all that much into what was happening in the story or increased my enjoyment of the story. But I mean, I did mostly enjoy it overall, just the imaginative experience of this boy in this household, which you're not really sure what he's doing there or why he's completely on his own, and this man who comes to kind of assist him and give him these items which seem to have these almost magical properties. And what I enjoyed most about this story was the sections, because this boy loves reading comics, and at one point the characters in these comics kind of climb out of the comics and then enter into his life. I just enjoyed the imaginative experience of that, and it just felt very creative. But then also there's this weird sort of naked man in a bog that he encounters, and who's quite sinister, and I didn't really understand what was going on, but just as almost like a weird dream that I experienced. I found it fun reading this novel, but I'm not sure it's one that I'm going to find particularly memorable. Moving on to some straightforward memoirs, I read The Instant by Amy Liptrot, which was shortlisted for the Wainwright Prize this year, and I was slightly hesitant of starting this book because of the description of it. I was worried it might be a bit too navel-gazing. It follows the author as she's moved to Berlin, looking for new experiences and to kind of start her life over after a period of addiction, and looking for romantic encounters. And she finds that there, but also a lot of loneliness and waywardness. She's not really sure what she wants to do in her life. She sort of takes odd jobs, and so finds money a bit of a struggle in supporting herself, but also has a lot of not very satisfying encounters with men she meets, but also meets a man that she grows a real attachment to, and has a real powerful love affair with, but also running us alongside this, and the slightly more nature side of this book, she's really attendant to the wildlife in the city, to the hawks, which she sometimes spies, but also is aware that there are raccoons living in the city, and she kind of tries to hunt out these raccoons and wants to have an encounter with them, and so following the natural beauty of the city, as well as the urban aspect aspects of this landscape and going to nightclubs, and at one point there's this beautiful section where she goes to a nightclub and she's dancing, and she feels like it's a kind of like underwater experience, and following that was just such like a beautiful, like, moving scene, and so yeah, overall I found this book really poignant. I was kind of caught off guard with how much I identified with it, and found it very sympathetic, and but also really beautifully written, and there's some wonderful observations in it, and it kind of it's slightly parallel, I think, to the very short book, the Passion by Annie Ernaux, which I read a year ago, and in following the workings of a very intense affair, especially one which doesn't work, and the kind of obsessions which arise around that, and all of the aspects of her personality which come out because of this romantic encounter which doesn't really work out. And so yeah, it was really moving experience. And slightly like similar to that, I read Gavin McCrea's memoir, which is slightly longer. It's over 300 pages long, and this book, which follows his experience during the recent lockdown, where he's from Ireland. He's written a couple of novels which I think are really excellent, and he's one of my favorite writers, so I was really excited and fascinated to read this book about his actual experience. And it follows the period of time over lockdown when he had, before the recent pandemic, he had moved back to Ireland for a writer's residency at a university, and moved in with his mother again. And he had left Ireland years ago, and sort of vowed to never go back, because he had quite a difficult and challenging childhood and difficult family experiences, and so he has a lot of hang-ups about the country he grew up in, quite justifiably so, because growing up, like you said, there was a lot of difficulty in his family. They weren't poor, but they definitely weren't. It wasn't sort of bounteous in their households. There was he had two brothers and a sister, and so the parents were working a lot and struggling to provide for them, but also to attend to them in the way that they needed to, like emotionally. And Gavin was enrolled in this school, which really wasn't appropriate for him, that he encountered like daily homophobic abuse while he was there for years. And so this was very traumatic to him, and so yeah, he wanted to leave Ireland, but then recently, with the pandemic and the circumstances of moving back in with his mother, who was showing signs of dementia, and so dealing with that. But then when the pandemic came on, he found himself locked in this apartment with the mother, who he had unresolved issues with because of the difficulties of his childhood. And so the memoir is recounting that period during lockdown, and how the apartment that they lived in, while most days they got along quite amicably, it was kind of like cells, and there was this underlying tension in their relationship with each other. But then also recounting the story of his early life, and all the difficulties he went through, both at school, but then later with relationships, and a man that betrayed him, and so he became HIV positive through this relationship, which he thought was monogamous, and he thought he could trust this man, but it turns out he couldn't. And so yeah, all of the difficulties he encountered while struggling to express himself as an artist, and he follows the method of how he developed his inspiration, his motivations behind his writing and wanting to create these literary artworks, which are really beautiful. And it's really moving that he created out of all of this difficulty and trauma these beautiful works of fiction so yeah, it's a really moving story following this book. He gives a really unique point of view and deals with things in with this rare honesty, I think, not only examining Ireland, his country, but also members of his family, but also his own life, his own psychology, and his own motivations, and so the darker side of his personality, as well as the lighter sides and the more artistic sides of his personality. It's a really moving account and a sort of reckoning with one's own past and one's own childhood and one's own family, and so the confrontation that occurs between him and his mother, which does eventually occur, is very moving, and yeah, I think it's an absolutely beautiful memoir, an incredibly unique account, and so yeah, really wonderful experience. And then finally, just to wrap up, I read this nonfiction book called Kingdom of Characters by Jing, which was such a fascinating account of the history of the Chinese language starting around 1900 and turn of the century, when China wanted to start opening itself out to the world. At that time, there was very low literacy rate in the country, and so the difficulty of adapting this very ancient language with very complicated characters to it that not a lot of people, including not a lot of people in China itself, could understand or read or write, and so yeah, adapting these characters in this language so that more people in the country could understand it and read it, but also that it could be translated and that China could have connections with the rest of the world, because previously with the language and the written form of communication, that was really difficult. And so it follows this over the course of a century through lots of periods of political change throughout Maoism and all of the challenges of that, but also the particular figures from Chinese history that were instrumental in changing the language so it could be adapted into the modern world. And you follow through these modern periods through the telegraph, and then later through the internet age, and so being able to use these characters on smartphones, and so yeah, it's a really fascinating account. Lots of interesting personalities she picks out from these figures from history that were so instrumental in changing and adapting the language. So it's a fascinating account of the country of China, as well as the nature of language itself and communication and how it's formed. And so yeah, a really interesting book. So those are all the titles I read. Like I said, if you've read any of these books, I'd love to know your thoughts about them, or other good things you've read in the past month that you want to tell me about, or maybe recommend to me. I'd love to hear about that in the comments below. But I hope you're doing well. I'm hoping over the next few weeks I might actually get some more relaxing reading time and be able to get really in depth into some books I've been meaning to get to before the end of the year. But hope you have a good day, and I'll speak to you again soon. Bye bye.